Jai Hind, ladies and gentlemen, I am Major Gaurav Arya, and today we have a very special guest on our show, the Chanakya Dialogues English. And the guest is General Raj Shukla, former Army Commander, RTRAC. RTRAC is an organization that is responsible for training across the Indian Army, and it has some cutting edge material. Today we're going to speak to the General about the possible changes or the possible lessons the Indian Army could learn from the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Sir, Jai Hind, and a very warm welcome to our show, sir.
Thank you, Gaurav. Great pleasure to be with you. Great pleasure.
Sir, so my first question is, you've seen, sir, that initially it was said that Russia will roll over Ukraine. It was said that this war is just going to last for a few days. And then it was said that, there is a primary objective, there is a secondary objective. But clearly, sir, to people who are neutral observers, it seems that Russia, a military superpower, is bogged down in Ukraine. What do you have to say about this, sir?
I would agree with you. It is somewhat perplexing and a mystery as to how this military superpower that Russia came to be, an army or a military which prided itself in fire and maneuver in the air-land battle, has unraveled so completely in all-out combat. So that is it is perplexing. It's a mystery. It is also relevant to India because much of our equipment and our inventory is similar. So there are a lot of lessons to learn. But before that, I would like to make a point about the larger strategic context. And that is about the utility of force in a transforming strategic landscape. And here I would just like to make two brief points, which may sound a little theoretical, but they are extremely pertinent to understanding what is going on in the Ukraine conflict. And that is this, that, we have in the recent past seen two changing paradigms of war. And I think we are now heading towards a third. I'll come to that a little later. But what were these changing paradigms of war? The first paradigm was of this massive industrial era conflict, which we saw in World War II, where we saw two conflicting ideologies, so say Nazi Germany and liberal Europe. When the ideologies were in conflict, the militaries of the two causes went to a battlefield. There was this massive industrial war, and the consequences of that war, or the winner of the war, his ideology came to rule. Then with nuclear weapons coming in, we saw war as this huge deciding event. Its utility somewhat waned. And then you came to what was called, the war amongst the people, where you could win a war militarily, but yet not achieve the political aim. So you what you saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, you destroyed the Al-Qaeda, you destroyed the Taliban, but the political promise could not be achieved. And so wars went along. That led to this somewhat erroneous refrain in hindsight that the days of all-out conflict are over. Or India mein bhi baat hone lagi ki abhi ladai nahi hogi. And that is what, even I think Putin's military, I just like to make one historical point. When the Soviet Union was at its peak, there was this Russian military, especially its tank force. They sent a chill down the spines of Western armies. It was professed that the Russian military would do this blitzkrieg across Europe and get to the English Channel in 48 hours, something like 4,000 kilometers. And here it hasn't got to Kyiv in 3 to 4 months, which is just about 300 kilometers. And the reason perhaps was that the Russian military, first from the days of the Soviet, of course, there was a massive come down. In Chechnya, it was equated with a street gang. And then Putin revived this military. And it started doing well in the gray zone maneuvers of Georgia, Crimea, limited wars like Syria, Libya. And Western analysts started describing it as this 21st century military learning and adaptive force. and Putin was winning as long as he was not fighting. His problems began when he started fighting. So it is because of this, in my view, inadequate understanding of the changing paradigm of war, and this force which was very adept at gray zone and information warfare, because it had not been nursed and nurtured in all-out lethal combat. And we'll come to the reasons. When you committed it to all-out lethal combat, which is an entirely different ball game, you saw it unravel so completely. So those are my initial thoughts, and we could pick on each of these and discuss them.
Sir, my next question to you is, sir, much has been spoken and written also by various journalists and Indian Army generals with decades of experience in armored warfare. Each saying that, tanks are still relevant, and finally, when you want to break through or hammer the enemy, it is the armored corps that will do it, the mechanized forces that will do it. And I understand a little of that, sir. But going back to Ukraine, Russia has thousands of tanks, perhaps the most modern in the world, if not the most modern, against an enemy that is decidedly militarily inferior. As far as the numbers go, my question to you is, sir, part one, where did Russia's mechanized forces go wrong? And part two, apart from the weapons and equipment, is there any other element of war that we are not talking about? Maybe motivation, maybe morale, maybe information warfare, sir. So these are my two questions, sir.
Okay, let's first get to that the tank question, and let me address it head on. To me, it does seem that the tank in its current form, the one we saw, these T-72s, 80s, 90s, which we saw being used in Ukraine, and we have a similar inventory. This does seem now to be a 20th century platform struggling to find its own in the 21st century battle. So that is the first point I would make. And the reason is that you have let the tank be a legacy platform. There are options of upgrading the tank fleet in terms of active protection systems, better situational awareness, fuse sensors. There are these things which can be added on to the tank to make it survivable. But because you refuse to admit that the tank is being challenged, you don't carry out these upgrades. And when you don't carry out these upgrades, the tank is a legacy platform against this suite of new and emerging technologies which are very precise. So I'll give you one example from Ukraine. And of course, there were examples before that. Or let's take the larger example. In 4 conflicts now, Idlib, Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Ukraine, the Bayraktar drone, along with associated EW system, has decisively challenged the traditional prima donnas of combat, which means large guns, large tanks, and even the aircraft, and not the Bayraktar, but other technologies. And even as these prima donnas are being challenged by the Bayraktar, the way militaries are, there is a hesitancy in admitting to it. And if you don't admit to it, how will you respond? Now, see what happened to the tank in Ukraine. You had these combination of these Puma and Switchblades. So I'm told the Puma and Switchblade operated in these 2-man combinations. The Puma went, spotted 5 tanks. The loiter Switchblade came, and they were maintaining a good standard distance, 5 to 6 kilometers. It came and simply took out those 5 tanks. Now, when you take out 5 tanks and the 20 crews go with it, and there is an advancing armor column, look at the motivation and the paralysis that is caused. So, if I may just draw the central lesson is that there is little doubt that this suite of small and emerging technologies based on precisionary, EW, smarter anti-tank weapons like the Javelin, even the Stinger, are challenging legacy platforms, capital-intensive legacy platforms. So the slang is that swarming is challenging surging. Swarming of drones, the surging of tanks. These small and light is better than large and heavy. There is no doubt about that. They are proving to be extremely vulnerable. Also, just see, like you also done a stint in the army, I've spent a lifetime. We were always told that the fundamentals of combat are fire and maneuver. But what if I posit before you that surveillance and precisionary have severely challenged fire and maneuver? Surveillance and precise attacks, they have become so potent that fire and maneuver is being challenged. It is being rendered hapless. And there were earlier indications. See, even see the tank. The initial part that I quoted about the art of war in the modern world is from a book by Rupert Smith, The Utility of Force. I'm sure you would have heard about it. Rupert Smith is a British armored corps general, and he makes this point that the last time the tank was used as a decisive platform in a design offensive maneuver was in the deserts of Sinai in 1973. Since that, whenever tanks have been used, they have followed air power enough, which means it's no fault of the tank. That's the way the modern battle has progressed. But the tank was being challenged by all these developments, also by this suite of small and emerging technologies. And what shall I say, those who think about tanks have not done enough to upgrade the tank, and that's why it's proving so vulnerable. So the lesson for modern military should be, when you draw up your budgets next year, make sure that you prioritize emerging technologies based on precision, there being light, microelectronics, so on and so forth, over legacy platforms. I'm not saying that you do away with it, but that prioritization has to change, because there is definite evidence, even in Ukraine, that these new emerging technologies did severely challenge these legacy platforms. Take air power, for instance. Now, Russian weaknesses in microelectronics have made them, what shall I say, conserve their PGMs. So if you're conserving PGMs, when you go and target enemy combat positions with dumb munitions, you are forced to go low. When you go low, in the first week, they lose about 20 aircraft. After that, for obvious reasons, the standoff distances are larger. That affects targeting. Because of your weaknesses in microelectronics, you don't have enough PGMs flowing. And now, 4 months into the war, Ukraine is still contested airspace. We have not seen much of SEAD. We have not seen much of DIAD. And the aircraft have proved particularly vulnerable to pop-up AD platforms and shoulder-fired missiles, Stinger, and so on and so forth. The immediate lesson for India is, and you must get somebody from the Air Force to perhaps answer it, but my deduction is that our ability to penetrate a more potent A2AD umbrella in the Western Theatre Command does need a revisit and a review, because there do seem to be problems because of the way the character of war has changed, and technology has become so central to the changing character.
So what I wanted to also ask you is that while most of our mech platforms, I mean almost all that I have seen, are essentially Russia-based, do we also have a lot of Russian teachings about tank warfare or mechanized warfare to go along with them? And if so, how badly have they been dented? Do you think there needs to be an urgent, think through in the Indian Army that, we have been practicing almost yearly basis with the Russians. We have spent billions of dollars buying Russian platforms, and suddenly we see these platforms being, picked out of thin air by these very small and highly mobile anti-tank jets who would go perhaps with a Javelin, sir, or perhaps with some other anti-tank system. Shoot, scoot, small little drones. You mentioned, sir, the Switchblade. And other platforms like that. So do you think there needs to be immediate rethinking? Because it is Russian after all, sir. Our equipment is largely Russian. I'm talking in the context of mechanized forces, sir.
See, absolutely. And it's the Indian Army has been, shall I say, conscious of this for a while now. I remember when I was DGPP, and we did a analysis of the survivability of Russian armor in Chechnya. And if I remember that figure right, out of 146 A-vehicle platforms, 122 were taken out by these missiles, anti-tank missiles. So in urban warfare, this has been a trend for long. Now, the context that you say, if the, what from the Russians as far as doctrines and what shall we say, operational philosophies are concerned, what should we be doing? So I would like to make two points. One is, if you have seen how wars have gone wrong over the last 3 to 4 decades. I mean, there was a lot of critique about Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine. One larger issue is that there is a disconnect, or shall I say, a lack of sufficient convergence between what the political bosses want and the military promises it can deliver. For example, Putin was told that it will be a walk-in, you'll be welcomed with flowers, and the Ukrainian military just won't stand up. And that is a very serious, shall I say, failure of assessment or whatever. So what are, say, some of the smarter armies doing? China and Israel, of course, spends a whole lot of time, a lot of energy in looking at strategic military futures. The US has recently, or I think 2 years back, set up this Futures Command, whose only job is to look at strategic military futures, doctrines, so on and so forth. Only job. The other combatant commands are focusing on today's readiness. They are looking at future readiness. By the way, RTRAC, you said, was training. RTRAC also does all this stuff, strategic military futures, doctrines. It's not captured in the acronym. So this is hugely important. If you have an ecosystem which can get the futures right, which can ensure politico-military convergence, you will now not have problems like this in the first place. So that ecosystem is equally important. The other thing which I say, draw this comparison from my younger days. When I was commissioned into the army, we used to do a lot of these large-scale maneuvers. So I remember Digvijay exercise, Mayfever, brass tacks, where commanders at the higher levels got a feel and experience of, shall I say, marshalling and orchestrating large-scale formations like corps and all. After that, gradually, the focus has, gone to these exercises without troops, with troops, where you have representative fractions, war games. These kind of things have gained more traction at the expense of these practical large-scale maneuvers. And see, when the Russians indulged in these large-scale maneuvers, the way you didn't see maneuvers, you didn't see those meeting engagements, shaping fires, that whole transition from deep combat to the close fight. The Russian armor columns were like logistic convoys lined up. So it speaks very poorly of their orchestration, marshalling. Look at their communications. The communications didn't work. So I'm told many of these Russian generals in the Russian army, they hopped onto the Ukrainian cellular net and they were picked up through data flows and taken out, if not all 12. This is bad professionalism. Moscow being taken out is bad professionalism because it does not only embody the sea, but it represents the power of the state. All these point to a severe decline in the Russian war apparatus. So we must, I would agree with you, we must do a very close audit of our inventory, of our doctrines, of our operational maneuvers, how we will orchestrate political military convergence. In the Indian context, the political leadership and the military top brass and the senior national security bureaucracy should sit and war game these scenarios so we get them as close as possible. Some of it is happening and some of it needs to be, shall I say, refined or taken to that next level. So I would agree with you completely that there are huge lessons not only in the inventory, in the platforms. As I said, how do we prioritize our purchases, legacy platforms, emerging technologies, but also in doctrines, tactics, techniques, and procedures. If the Bayraktar has become such a potent platform, what are we doing? And I'm sure much of it is already happening. People are taking a look. I'm just underlining, emphasizing it.
Absolutely. So my last question to you, sir, is, this is something that I've been personally fascinated with, and perhaps my exposure is not so much. And I think today is a great opportunity for me to learn also, sir. Normally, when we talk about FEBUA, sir, or fighting in built-up areas, what comes to mind, and I could be absolutely wrong, sir, but what comes to mind is infantry. Now, whether you look at Iraq or Chechnya or even Ukraine today, sir, there is this sense of mechanized forces being lured into cities where you have a lot of places where you can hide. Small anti-tank deaths can attack, shoot and scoot, go away. And this was pretty much what was happening in the Battle of Leningrad also. So Stalingrad, I beg your pardon, sir. This was happening long back. So Russians apparently have forgotten their own lessons. But do you think this is also important, sir, fighting in built-up areas for the armored? Because it is going to happen with the increase in population. Let's say even Pakistan, sir, where not all, but most of our mechanized forces are facing, sir. There will be new towns, villages, cities, and the tanks, either they absolutely skirt around, sir, but if they have to go in the middle, should they also be prepared for fighting in built-up areas?
Yeah, absolutely. See, I mean, it does appear to distant observers that even their combined arms warfare has not been done with. I mean, where was the infantry which protects the armor? Of course, a lot of them got taken out when those, BMPs were taken out. But the job of the infantry is to protect the armor, especially in these FIWA kind of situations. And there are very well laid down drills for it. At least in the Indian Army, they are fine-tuned to the letter T. Now, I don't know if you can't get the nitty-gritty from these videos and these commentaries, but it does seem that this infantry armor cooperation, which are whole, what shall I say, areas of study and practice in the Indian Army, one didn't see it, and that is why it surprises me greatly, because we all thought very well of the professionalism of the Russian army, but we don't see very much of it. And not only that, see, there are very obvious lessons for us. The Air Force, Army, and Navy in Ukraine seem to be fighting individual battles. Whatever is happening in the Black Sea does not seem to be impacting operations in southern Ukraine, the Air Force, Army. No. So the other lesson is, which we are dragging our feet on, theater commands, jointness, integration. We simply cannot afford to drag our feet on this. So theater commands is an absolute necessity. They must come up in much faster time frames, and not as industrial era entities, but digitized theater commands. So the theater commands that we get should be serviced by a tri-service cloud, served by precision reassistance, so on and so forth. That is the other lesson. The third lesson is, look at this. The initial parts, the various offensives were put under these Russian military districts or sub-districts, each offensive under a different commander. Now they have realized the folly and appointed a theater commander. And since the theater commander has come, it does seem that the Russians are doing better both in the east and the south. And all these lessons we are dragging our feet. So there will be very severe consequences in conflict if we don't move up the jointness paradigm very fast, because the lessons have been there for a huge time and they have been reiterated in Ukraine. So combined arms warfare, jointness, integration. In fact, if you see today in the West, jointness is passé. They have moved to integration, cross-pollination, complete civil-military fusion. And here I like to make a point about Musk's Starlink terminals. See, now the private sector is not only important for capacity building, it is important for combat. And the example are these Starlink terminals. You just see what happens. The Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, I think Fedorov is his name, he one day finds that they are without internet access. It is affecting the nation. It is affecting military operations. So he tweets to Elon Musk, requesting for those terminals. Those terminals come in 48 hours, and what do? They are used for strategic communications. Zelensky uses those terminals, which are basically LEO configurations for better data flows, uses them to address global councils, United Nations, British Parliament, so on and so forth. They are used to reinforce street resolve. This great street resolve on the back of which the Ukrainians have pushed back. One of the reasons were these Starlink terminals. It is used to boost troop morale. And they are also used to link thermal imaging devices atop drones with artillery gun positions. So for target designation. And they become so potent that they are targeted by Russian air power. And when that happens, Musk's team devises a few codes, and through those codes, he enhances the survivability of these terminals. Now, these private sector competencies, which are coming, innovation, energy, enterprise, agility, don't come so easily from government. And therefore, once again, this Futures Command, this is the first time I have seen the Futures Command publicly. You go to its website, it says it is a private-public partnership. I cannot imagine in my career an army institution or an army combat organization professing to be a public-private enterprise. So this is how national security and warfare is getting complicated, which means you need technology from any source, talent of any kind. You simply have to fuse it. And if I may just make one more point, we should never forget this. A few years of peace and we start pushing the instrument of force to the corners of our strategic outlook. And the way deterrence has failed, or the way deterrence works, it has once again re-emphasized the point that the surest guarantor of peace is an instrument of force which is joint. And we know how difficult it is to get joint. We know it in the Indian context. Calibrated, what the Prime Minister has been pushing for, right sizing. Don't be so large, don't be so heavy that you have no technology. So calibrated, joint, ready. Every country has an army, but Russia, as the conflict has proved, their military was not in the highest levels of readiness. So joint, calibrated, ready, technologically enabled. What countries like USA, China, and Israel are today doing to embrace technology is simply mind-boggling. We can have another session. We have also started adapting, embracing these technologies. Today, these emerging technologies of like AI, big data, quantum, so on and so forth, they are no longer theoretical pieces for the civilians to master. They are changing the character of war in very intimate ways. So this is the huge challenge. If I say the surest guarantor of peace is a joint, calibrated, technology-enabled force, I mean, they are 4 words, but they will take 3 decades to create. But that is the surest guarantor of peace. We must never forget this. And here I must, recall Kautilya, who said this so many years back, and his words ring so true. He says, अगर अपनी संस्कृति को भूलोगे, अपने शास्त्र को भूलोगे, तो संस्कृति खो दोगे. अगर शस्त्र का त्याग करोगे, तो राष्ट्र ही खो. He is telling you time and again that do not neglect the instrument of force. But 2 years down the conflict, and we'll be back to, how economic statecraft can be used for deterrence and this and that. Look at Europe. I heard Fareed Zakaria saying the other day, Europe accounts for 20 to 25% of the world's GDP. They account for 40% of arms exports, and yet they are unwilling to invest in a military which will defend their own borders, this very prosperous entity, because they use the military to create jobs, to create the military industrial complex, and now see how vulnerable they are to Putin. And it has larger consequences because unless Europe gets strategically autonomous and strong in defense, USA cannot pivot to the Indo-Pacific, where the actual threat is growing. So, this whole point about how important the instrument of force is, and I'm not saying, as an instrument to jackboot around the world, certainly not, but as a calibrated instrument which can be used when your national interests so require. And why I'm reiterating this point is because this is a point in India we forget very soon. So the surest guarantor of peace is this instrument of force, which must be in constant states of readiness. And I just would like to make one point about this. It is not about budgets alone. See what Ukraine has proved you can do by way of asymmetric aggression. Russia's budget was 10 times that of defense budget Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken. In tanks, they had a superiority of 6-1. But through strategic imagination, tactical guile, resolve, see what they have done. USA's budget is thrice that of China. But China, through all this restructuring, joint commands, theater commands, massive investments in technology, so on and so forth, they are causing displacement anxiety amongst the Americans. The differential between China and India in terms of budgets is once again about 3:1. If we were to do all this, which we are not doing at the pace at which we are, which we should, jointness, so on and so forth, we would cause similar displacement anxiety amongst the Chinese. A smart, asymmetric addressor, it does not mean necessarily pushing in money when required. So these are all opportunities galore before us. If we are smart, if we are observant, all these lessons can be internalized in the Indian context and implemented.
Yes. Yes. Thank you very much for your time, sir. It was indeed a great conversation, and I got this opportunity to learn a lot, sir. Opened a lot of windows in my mind. I was thinking differently, and now I know better. Thank you very much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, viewers, with Lieutenant General Raj Shukla, former Army Commander RTRAC, and he spoke about a lot of things. He spoke about how the Ukraine-Russia war is going and what India needs to do. What are the lessons for India? What are the lessons for the world? And how is warfare going to look like 2-3 decades from now? What do we need to do? It's not just about money. It's also about how you strategically look at the options in front of you. Thank you for joining. And before I go, let me request you to like this video, subscribe, and don't forget to press the bell icon. Jai Hind.